It's really nice to be with you guys. Get into my computer here. We are going to be in Judges chapter 6, verse 1 through 35 today. Judges chapter 6. If you are using this Bible that's in the pews, it's page 238. But if you brought your own, I can't help you with the page number. Judges chapter 6. All right, this is what it says. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts and caves and strongholds. And whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkey. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count the men and their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. We see this cycle a lot in Judges where they do evil, they turn to these other gods, and then the Lord kind of lifts his hand of protection. And then all of these nations come in and they start ravaging them, and then it says that they cry out to God, and then God has to send someone to save them. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I snatched you from the power of Egypt and from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them from before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you haven't listened to me." The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. Again, they're hiding in these caves. He's down in this hole in the ground threshing wheat, which is very difficult to do at that time. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior," which he is feeling pretty terrified as it is, so he's surprised, and he says, "But sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "But Lord," Gideon asked, "how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family." And the Lord answered, "I'll be with you, and you'll strike down all the Midianites together." Gideon replied, "If now I found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it's really you talking to me. Please don't go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you." And the Lord said, "I'll wait for you to return." Gideon went in, prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast, putting the meat in a basket and its broth in a pot. He brought them out and offered them to him under the oak. The angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth." And Gideon did so. With the tip of the staff that was in his hand, the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "Ah, sovereign Lord, I've seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But the Lord said to him, "Peace, don't be afraid, you're not going to die." So Gideon built an altar to the Lord there, and he called it, "The Lord is Peace." To this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. That same night the Lord said to him, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering." So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the men of the town, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. In the morning, when the men of the town got up, there was Baal's altar demolished, with the Asherah pole beside it cut down and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. They asked each other, "Who did this?" And when they carefully investigated, they were told, "Gideon, son of Joash, did it." The men of the town demanded of Joash, "Bring out your son. He must die, because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." But Joash replied to the hostile crowd around him, "Are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar." So that day they called Gideon Jerubbaal, saying, "Let Baal contend with him, because he broke down Baal's altar." Now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. And so they too went up to meet them. You might know the end of the story, that Gideon has a great victory over Midian. As I was studying this and reading this, there is a strange phrase that caught my eye within this passage that I had never noticed before. It says, God says to Gideon, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old, and offer it as a burnt offering." And I didn't know, what does that term second bull mean? Because it doesn't mention a first bull anywhere in there. And so I was like, what is he talking about here? What is the meaning behind this? And so I started to do a little bit of research to try to learn more about what God meant by the second bull. And this is what I found. I found written online, they said, the first bull would be the prime male that would be used to impregnate the reproducing cows in a herd. When calves are born, most of the males are castrated. I don't know, has anybody here ever done farm work? What's the term for a castrated bull? A steer, right, a steer. And so those steers, some of them would be made into beasts of burden. Most would be slaughtered for their meat. Both required neutered males. Steers are much safer and easier to handle than uncastrated bulls. And then going on to say the one exception was the second bull, and the second bull was the backup in the event of an accident or death of the first bull. Okay, so they would have one that was meant to impregnate, and then the second bull is their backup plan. And so that's the idea of the second bull. It's this backup plan. If the first bull can't produce any longer, if it gets injured, if it gets killed, you got a contingency plan in place. Another one that's waiting in the wings. And as I was reading this, I feel like this applied to Gideon, to the story of Israel in a straightforward way. For Israel, I think Baal worship had become their second bull. They figured, God, he's our first, we're putting all our hope on him, right? But we have this second bull just in case. God will probably come through for us, but just in case, it's always smart to keep a second bull. And then if for some reason God doesn't show up, we've already got plan B lined up for ourselves. We'll still be okay because we've started worshiping Baal and Asherah and all these other Canaanite idols. Right? This is their logic here. And so Baal was the Canaanite deity of weather and agriculture. So if Israel wanted their crops to grow, they thought to themselves, it can't hurt to toss a few sacrifices Baal's way, right? Like, that could possibly be a way that we could become wealthy, Maybe he is something. Maybe we should consider this. And so that's what Israel did. And it was an act of greed completely, because before this point, they weren't suffering at all. In fact, they lived in this beautiful land that was described as flowing with milk and honey. They had everything they needed and then some, but they just wanted that little bit more. And so in the greed of their hearts, they thought, yeah, why not throw some sacrifices towards Baal? Doesn't hurt to hedge your bets, right? And so they thought about God, yeah, he's still our first bull. He's the first one for us, but if something happens, it doesn't hurt to have a second. Asherah was the Canaanite deity of sex and love. And the way they would honor her is they would visit the temple prostitutes and do what you do with prostitutes. And you can see why the Israelite men might be enticed and ensnared by this. You know, the culture right next door says that it's a spiritual act to cheat on your wife with one of these temple prostitutes. And they said, well, if you say so, you know, I've always been a religious man myself. You understand why God detested this practice, though. God hated that they were beginning to mix this type of worship with true worship of God. Like, this is vile in God's sight, the idea to be visiting these temple prostitutes, doing these different things. And so God comes to Gideon and he commands him, kill the second bull. And I can't help but think there's some symbolism there. There's some, like, a word picture there for us. And just in case that picture isn't clear enough, God specifies it's the second bull that has been in your house for 7 years. Where have you seen that number before? It's right there in verse 1, if you go back. It says in verse 1, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. And so God told Gideon, take this specific bull from your father's cattle, one that was born 7 years earlier, right at the start of all of this mess, right as Midian began oppressing Israel, and they've begun on this wayward path away from God. And as soon as that bull's life ends, the reign of Midian is also going to end. And so there's almost this strange symbolism I see there where Midian's rule is running concurrent with this bull's life. When it was born, they rose into power, and then on the day that it dies, their power ends. God breaks it. And on top of this, Baal, if you don't know this, was almost always depicted as a bull from the Canaanite, like the Canaanites. In their statues and in their paintings, they would depict him as a bull. So Gideon's told, kill the second bull. And so that bull that's been in his house for 7 years is to be killed, just as there's been this altar to Baal in his house for the last 7 years. He's commanded to tear down his father's altars in order to bring the wood to then sacrifice this bull. Did you catch that? That the altar of Baal and Asherah are in his father's household. And so he grew up around this, most likely. Like his own father is doing this. In fact, in verse 27, it says Gideon was afraid of his own family and the townspeople. And so he tore down the altar at night rather than the daytime. Gideon is literally scared that his family is going to kill him. That is how corrupt Israel has become over these 7 years. But if Israel is going to be cleansed, Gideon has to start in his own home. These altars to foreign gods, they're a stain on Israel, and they have to be removed if Gideon is going to serve the Lord. In our lives, we don't literally worship idols. We don't bow down before false gods, right? And so it probably doesn't look like Baal worship for us, but that doesn't mean that we, and especially others in America, are so different from what Gideon's family and the rest of Israel was. How many churchgoers today have a backup plan just in case God doesn't come through? You know, yeah, you're my plan A, God, but just in case, I've got this over there. Sometimes I think even as we're praying, we're coming up with contingency plans in our mind, right? Of what we're going to do if God doesn't answer this one. And it completely saps your prayer of all faith if while you're thinking, you know, by the time you finish the prayer, you're like, all right, now I'm going to move in the direction of what I already had in my mind. And you don't expect God to come through. And so you're just praying kind of empty words, and then you're just running ahead with plan B, right? We've probably all done this at some point where you know by the time you're done praying, you've already come up with what you're doing in case God doesn't help. I think for many millions of people, their second bowl, that plan B, that if God doesn't come through, it's their money. You remember Jesus said to us, no one can serve two masters. Either you'll hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. But that doesn't keep people from trying, does it? They claim that God's first, he's first in my life, but they have to keep the bank account full just in case he doesn't show up, because that's your lifeboat, right? That's the life raft if he doesn't give you what you're praying for. These people figure, the family will be all right, even if God doesn't show up, because I have enough saved up, right? I've done enough. And so they work and they store away in barns, stockpiling what they can, because they got to have that second bowl. If something goes wrong with plan A, plan B is already lined up for them. But the Bible calls that idolatry. It's no different than Baal worship. Colossians 3:5 literally says, greed is idolatry. Look it up for yourself. It says, greed is idol worship. And so the Lord puts Baal worship in the same category as greed, in the same category as us making that contingency plan with our money, that if God doesn't show up, I've always got that little bit saved up. Have you stored up things for yourself without being rich towards God? Today is a good day to tear that idol down. You remember Jesus told the rich young ruler to sell all of his possessions and give the money to the poor, because money was his idol, without a doubt. And it was no different for him than Baal. That's the altar he worshiped at. And it says he went away sad because he couldn't let go of that safety net. That what if, Jesus' disciples, they had nothing. They had no place to lay their heads. They were all homeless. And he didn't really want to let go of that safety net, his backup plan, his second bowl. And so he walked away from Jesus sad and didn't follow him. God tells Gideon, put to death the second bowl. Kill the backup plan. Which that might seem foolish, except for the fact that plan A is God himself, and God does not ever fail. The root of Christianity is faith in God. And you will always be safe in his hand if you trust him wholeheartedly. The Lord is a wonderful refuge and a strong tower for those who put their faith in him. And you'll never have to worry again if you seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. He says everything else that you ever need, it's provided for you if you seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. Here's what Israel didn't realize, because they thought it was wise to throw some sacrifices towards Baal and some towards Asherah. But what they didn't realize is their second bull, their Baal worship, was why they had suffered for the past 7 years. And as soon as that second bull is killed, as soon as the Baal altar is torn down, the oppression stops instantly. Midian is defeated immediately. Israel never would have suffered under the Midianites if they didn't come up with this backup plan. But their greed and their worry turned them to Baal and these other deities, and that's where their trouble all started. When Gideon says, "Where have you been, Lord? Where are these miracles we've heard of?" He says this straight to God's face. I think God would have been justified to say, "What do you mean? You put Baal on your throne, not me. He was the one running Israel for the last 7 years. You put him in the position of your God." And all of Israel learned very quickly how useless Baal was to them. They chose a chunk of stone, this idol, as their ruler. And so they got the results that happen when you worship a chunk of stone. Namely, it does nothing for you. And I would like to remind every one of us in this room, if a handful of green paper is your ruler, you get the results that happen when you worship paper, namely nothing. You cannot serve two masters. Gideon's name means one who cuts down, or the literal translation is actually like hewer, like you take an axe and you hew something down with it, right? You chop with an axe. His role was to hew down the idols of Israel, to these false idols they had gone to make room for worship of the Lord within this nation. And so like a forest fire that clears out all the dead and rotting undergrowth and wood to make room for new growth, we have to allow God to remove that which is dead in us, to make room for new growth and so that we can become a new creation. Gideon was only allowed to build an altar to God after he tore down the one that his father had built for Baal. First, the altar to Baal had to come down, and then he could truly worship his Lord. He cleared a space for God in his home. And ultimately, he cleared a space for God in his whole nation. And I really wish that's where his story ended. I wish that we could end on that happy note, but Gideon's story takes a sour turn at the end. And I want to end today's message by reading the conclusion of his story. If you flip 2 pages over to Judges chapter 8, we're going to read 10 verses in there. Judges 8, verse 22 through 32. This is Gideon just had this major victory. He just won the battle against Midian, and he comes home, and it says, the Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you've saved us out of the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." So far so good, that's great. But then he said, "I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." It was custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. And they answered, "We'll be glad to give them." And so they spread out a garment, and each man threw a ring from his plunder into it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head again. During Gideon's lifetime, the land enjoyed peace for 40 years. Jerubbaal, remember that's what they had named Gideon, son of Joash, went back home to live. He had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son, whom he named Abimelech. Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Israel asks Gideon to be their king, and he says the right thing. He says, no. God is your king. I'm not ever meant to be your king. But he follows up with, "But I do have one request. Give me an earring from the plunder, each of you." One earring, it sounds like a small request, right? It's not that big of a thing. It added up to being 43 pounds of gold, which I looked that up because I was curious. In today's money, that's $2.5 million worth of gold if we had that much today. And so he gets this massive fortune from winning this battle. And then he uses the gold to make an ephod, which an ephod, if you don't know, is kind of a vest-like, shirt-like covering that the high priest would wear when he ministered in the temple. And so Gideon says no to the position of king, but he wants to make himself into a priest. And that was expressly forbidden for anyone who's not a Levite. And he's from the tribe of Manasseh. The people of Israel had been commanded to worship God only at the tent of meeting, but Gideon wants to make a new place of worship with his family at the center in his town of Ophrah. He wants everyone to come to him to worship, while he wears his fancy ephod that cost him millions of dollars, like the high priest would wear his ephod. But looking like a priest does not make you a priest in God's eyes. Even though Gideon's ephod was far more pricey than the real one, the Lord didn't accept him as that priest. And with $2.5 million of gold put into this thing, it's not long before Gideon and all of Israel comes to this place and they begin to worship this ephod, it says, prostituting themselves by worshiping this thing. Gideon tore down the altar of Baal and then brought home a shiny new idol to take its place. And it elevated his little town into this major traffic center of Israel because people came from all over the nation to worship at his roadside attraction. You remember how Gideon's dad had owned the important altar to Baal and Asherah in town? Now Gideon gives them a new chunk of metal to worship. Like father, like son. It's like he digs one hole to fill an identical hole. He tears down an idol and immediately replaces it with his own. It doesn't matter if it's in the shape of Baal or if it's in the shape of a high priest's ephod. When they worship that gold, it is an idol, and it is wrong in God's eyes. He replaced the almighty, infinite God of Israel with a piece of rock. Again. But how often do we give our attention and our time to this shiny rock in our pockets? Almost to the point of worship sometimes, right? The amount of time and energy and focus that goes to this thing in our pockets. And how often in our lives do we tear down an idol, some sin in our lives, just to build it back up again? Lord, I pray that you will help us to truly put you on the throne. Lord, please destroy our idols once and for all. Galatians 5:1 says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." Gideon had been freed from Midian. He had been set free from all this Baal worship and all this ugliness, and then he let himself be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. He put himself into it. And if you find yourself back where you were, I would say to you, destroy the idol again. When Gideon realized that he had replaced God with another rock, he should have immediately taken his 10 servants and destroyed the ephod in the middle of the night, just as he had done to the altar of Baal, right? Men and women of God, I would say to you, destroy that idol as many times as it takes. And if you find yourself back at it again in a week, get up in the night and destroy it again. After all of this, Gideon names his son Abimelech, which means, my father is king. After all of his claiming that he didn't want the throne for himself, no, that's God's place, he names his son, my dad is king. And I wish for his sake that Gideon had just kept the Lord on the throne. And I hope for our sake that we learn to keep the Lord on the throne of our lives. Don't try to claim that place for yourself. And don't set up idols between you and him. And so I'll ask you today, what's your second bowl? Do you have a plan B just in case the Lord doesn't come through? Maybe you're relying on the relationships that you have that are kind of a safety net for you. Do you lean on another person as your crutch? Is your spouse the foundation under your feet that you have built everything on rather than on God? Or are you relying on your own strength, your own job, the money in your bank account? Is that your second bowl? Just in case, it's good to have, right? I'm here to urge you today, let the Lord be your plan A and kill the second bowl. There's never a need for a backup plan because the Lord doesn't falter, and there is no safer foundation for your life to be built upon than on Jesus and the words of the gospel, to his words that he spoke to us. You know the old song, "The wise man builds his house upon the rock. The A wise man builds his house upon the rock. A wise man builds his house upon the rock, and the house on the rock stands firm. Remember that one, right? Or maybe you've gone back to an idol that you tore down in the past, and somehow you're caught in that snare again. You've gone back to the same sins over and over, and you say, what am I doing back here? Don't give up hope. Go to the Lord right now and just say, Lord, I'm tearing it down again. Please forgive me and give me victory over this sin. Set me free from my addictions. You might have to tear down the idol 100 times over again, but the Lord will change you if you keep coming back to him. Don't ever stop. The Holy Spirit will change you into a man or a woman of God. I would say to you, pray for a hunger and thirst for righteousness, because Jesus promised us that those who have a hunger for righteousness, it's filled, right? It's right there in the Beatitudes. Those who have it, it'll be filled. So pray for that hunger and thirst for righteousness. Jesus is our plan A. And so let's give him all of ourselves. Let's trust him fully and not come up with plan Bs and contingencies and what ifs. Let's say to him, when I pray about something, Lord, I'm looking to you as the one who will give it to me. And really mean that in our hearts.